Good evening. I'm Charlie Hale, Sage Sarah Miller McCune, Dean of Social Sciences, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome all of you to this dialogue on a vitally important topic titled Not Too Late. The dialogue is hosted by the 2035 Initiative. The 2035 Initiative is a showcase collaboration here at UC Santa Barbara, an effort that both builds on the best qualities of the campus and intentionally disrupts a few others. Its goals are to develop research-based political and policy roadmaps to put us on track for decarbonization by 2035. It's a collaboration of environmental policy and politics researchers at UCSB, a group of scholars who, with all due humility, have achieved world-class stature. In this, our best campus qualities shine. It also embodies three creative disruptions. First, the 2035 Initiative is not a center, and it has no pretensions of becoming one. They don't have time for institution building. Their commitments are eminently publicly facing, deploying academic prowess to effect political and societal change. Second, following from this, their academic rigor lies precisely in the fact that they are value-driven, not value-neutral. They contest complacencies and deferrals, both within the academy and more broadly, that lull us into the belief that timid responses and incremental change will be enough to stave off climate calamity. Third, 2035 is an exciting, and at least in my 5 years here, an unprecedented partnership between the Division of Social Sciences and the Institute for Energy Efficiency housed in the College of Engineering. With initiatives like 2035, we're delivering on the promise that environmental stewardship and environmental justice are integral to our campus DNA, offering research excellence to inform, motivate, and accompany climate action. This evening, we're thrilled to host writer, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit. Our discussion will focus on her new anthology on climate action titled, like the forum, Not Too Late, which aims to transform the story that we tell one another about climate change, from despair and indifference to hope and possibility. Joining the conversation are two contributors to this collection and UCSB's own, Dr. Leah Stokes and Nikayla Jefferson. Rebecca Solnit is the author of some 20 books which span topics from feminism to social change to catastrophe and hope. Her book titles beckon us and encapsulate her extraordinary and widely affirmed talent for narrating complex and crucial ideas in accessible analytical prose and storytelling, which captures the reader's imagination. Orwell's Roses, Reflections of My Non-Existence, Hope in the Dark, Men Explain Things to Me, A Paradise Built in Hell, The Fairway Nearby, and A Field Guide to Getting Lost. A product, and she was very keen for me to say this, a product of California public education system, from kindergarten to graduate school, yes. One of these elite private schools for Rebecca. Rebecca Solnit writes for The Guardian and serves on the board of the climate group Oil Change International, and has recently launched the climate project also named Not Too Late. Her recent book of that title provides orienting information to climate movement newcomers and encouragement for those who have been active for long enough to feel just a little weary. To frame and disseminate this project, she's co-edited this book with Thelma Young Lutunatabua. Hope I got that right. The book features writings from around the world that address the political, scientific, and social, emotional dimensions of humanity's most urgent threat. After the talk, please stay around because Chaucer's bookstore will be at the back selling copies of the book, and you can have your copies signed. Two of the anthology's UCSB contributors will join Rebecca for the conversation. Dr. Leah Stokes and Nikayla Jefferson. Nikayla Jefferson is a doctoral student in political science at UCSB, where she researches American environmental politics and social movements, and has a bio that's very, very resonant with the 2035 initiative, I would say. In 2019, Nikayla co-founded the Sunrise Movement San Diego Hub, and later served as full-time writer and organizer for the national team. Nikayla is also a creative writer whose work has been featured in The Guardian, The Nation, The Boston Globe, and elsewhere. Dr. Leah Stokes is Anton Vonk Chair in Environmental Politics in the Department of Political Science. She's also affiliated with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and Environmental Studies. Leah serves as advisor to the electrification nonprofit Rewiring America and co-hosts the Climate Podcast, which I heartily recommend to you all, A Matter of Degrees. In 2022, she was named an advocate of Time 100 Next and one of Business Insider's top 30 global leaders working toward climate solutions. I've heard Leah described by some in our division as our very own rock star, a description I'm glad to affirm, except that it might understate the monumental importance of her work in academia. Leah and her 2035 colleagues are opening a path, a way forward for publicly engaged, social justice-centered, and ethically accountable transformation, not just of environmental politics, but of higher education writ large. This is another absolutely urgent task for our times, and for this also, it's not too late. But we have to get to work, taking inspiration from activist intellectuals like Rebecca Solnit and collective projects like 2035. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rebecca Solnit, Nikayla Jefferson, and Leah Stokes.
The weather has been so gray lately that we were wondering if you would all go sunbathing rather than coming tonight. But here you are, no sun for you. Instead, you're inside with us. But it's wonderful to be here. We're going to have a conversation tonight between the three of us, and afterwards you're welcome to buy a copy of the book, or if you have copies yourself, and we will be signing them, particularly Rebecca in the back. So we're going to look forward to that. So to kick off our conversation, Rebecca, I have a question for you, which is, what was some of the inspiration that took you to writing this anthology and beginning this activist work around Not Too Late?
I just want to point out that you and Nikayla wrote some of the anthology, as did 18 other people, and my collaborator, Thelma Young Lutuna Tabua. So Thelma and I started talking in 2020 about wanting to do something to address a lot of the climate grief, anxiety, despair, defeatism, doomism, particularly when it felt like it was due to bad facts and bad frameworks. Not only do a lot of people think it's too late, we don't have the solutions, we don't know what to do, nobody cares, nobody's doing anything, all of which are false. But they often also have models of how change works, what the nature of power is, what's required of us to make this transition, that are inaccurate and often inaccurate in ways that are very disempowering. So Thelma, who's in her 30s, a longtime climate activist, now based in Fiji, currently with the Solutions Project, and I spent a while talking. We started a project, which is just a website and social media that we launched in early 2022 called Not Too Late. And this very funny thing happened, which is why there's this book. So a wonderful activist was in town who I met, Saket Soni with Resilience Force, which is organizing the undocumented people who clean up after climate disasters, both to protect them as laborers, celebrate their skills and build relationships with the communities they clean up after, particularly when those are anti-immigrant communities who are often transformed and realizing who's saving them and rebuilding for them. But Saket had worked in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I met him through Annie Leonard, who was the co-director of Greenpeace USA. And I was like, you have to meet Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist at UC Berkeley, who worked in the same community. So I organized this little dinner at Adam and Arlie Hochschild's house. And Adam Hochschild, the great writer in his own right, as well as the husband of the great sociologist, had us do a go-round and talk about who we were and what we were doing. There was 7 of us, I think, and I went last and was like, well, I've stopped writing books because I'm trying to be a better climate activist, and Thelma and I are launching this new project next month. And basically the whole group of people just looked at me and said, Rebecca, that needs to be a book. I was like, okay. And I think in some weird Protestant way, that's not my normal way. I thought that because I really like writing books and it's the only thing I really know how to do, there was something renunciatory about not writing books. But books are a very good way to bring information together, to reach people, etc. And I'd actually secretly kind of been thinking it. So by 10:30 the next morning, we had an agreement to publish, and we're off and running. Because I already had a relationship with Haymarket, the publisher, and it was kind of an amazing project. Thelma is a true organizer. She came and stayed with me for a week and turned a big sheet of Corten I had, not Corten, but into a whiteboard, because you cannot be an organizer without whiteboards. And so we just wrote on Post-its what we thought the book should cover. We wanted to create something very broad and accessible. We felt like there's a ton of books on climate. Most of them are more specialized. Some of them are very technical and not so accessible to newcomers. But often they just focus on one aspect of it. And it didn't feel like there was a really welcoming overview guide that both helped equip people with what you might need to know and was not just all discouraging and doomy and gloomy. And so we divided up what we thought the subject should be, then we brainstormed about who should write it, and it was really magical. Everyone we asked said yes. Some of them were interviews, most of them wrote or rewrote essays for us, and it ended up just being our dream team of 20 people from around the world, majority women, majority people of color, and I think it worked out really well. And thank you both for contributing. Nikayla was suggested by our mutual friend Eric and brought us a beautiful, heartfelt essay about organizing a climate strike at the White House with Sunrise. And Leah was kind of our pinch hitter because a piece that was supposed to cover what I call the renewables revolution didn't really. And I was like, we have to cover it. We have to have it. And Leah cranked it out in 2 weeks, I think. And it was great. So that's the short version, or maybe that's the long version of how this came to be a book. And one thing that's striking to me, I kind of believe that we need both cultural change and some very pragmatic changes of infrastructure, energy systems, etc. And I wanted to ask Leah how she sees the cultural, spiritual, kind of social transformations fitting in with the stuff that she's a policy expert on, which is electrifying everything, leaving the age of fossil fuel behind, moving to renewable energy.
So, as Rebecca said, a lot of my work is about the physical transformations that we have to make to infrastructure. So moving to 100% renewable energy as fast as possible, electrifying everything we can. If we do those two things alone, it can actually cut 3/4 of current carbon pollution. So climate change can feel really overwhelming. There's all these different pollutants. They come from so many different sectors. But it actually just boils down to clean electricity plus electrification for the vast majority of the solution. So how does that interface with the more cultural change and the spiritual change? Well, we're seeing an example of it right now with the gas stoves debate. So for a while now, I don't know, a few couple dozen of us have been going on about how gas stoves are really bad for your health, because gas stoves are really bad for your health. And we were going along talking about this. I went to Congress. I literally said it in front of Ted Cruz, and, you know, said it on TV, blah, blah, blah. Nobody was really picking up on it, except my sisters, who watched me say these things, and they were like, oh my God, my gas stove is terrible. I need to get rid of it. So clearly it had these seeds of change, that people were looking at their appliances differently. But suddenly, right, there was this huge breakthrough cultural moment where the Consumer Protection Safety Commission, Commissioner Trumpka, said that he was looking into maybe restricting gas stoves because they're really bad for your health, just like cigarettes. And it created this huge cultural moment. There was something like 23,000 news articles written on the subject of gas stoves, literally, since the beginning of this year. Crazy. So this sort of niche conversation that a lot of us were having had this huge cultural moment. And if you look at where gas stoves exist, they are in California and New York primarily, where mostly lefties live, you may know. And so it's an interesting thing where if we can start to look at the machines in our lives that run on fossil fuels and realize that they're not only terrible for the planet, they're also really bad for our health. I mean, the latest research is that when you burn gas in your home, you are putting out formaldehyde, benzene, those are both carcinogens. You're putting out levels of nitrous oxide that is way higher than EPA standards. So I think it starts to get people to ask different questions around, what are these machines in my life, whether that's the car in my driveway, the stove in my kitchen, the furnace in my garage. What are these machines, and are these the machines that I have to keep using? Or can there be different machines that do 99% or actually are better than the alternative, save me money, don't poison me and my family members? You know, that's some of the cultural change pieces that I think we're on the precipice of. And what I would say is that I'm not interested in a conversation around like sacrifice. I'm actually interested in a conversation around abundance. I now have a fully electrified home, and it's awesome. It's like really nice. People came over last night, and it was really nice. So like, you don't have to have a crappy house and sit with your big sweater in the dark, okay? Like, you can do that if you want, but you don't have to. You can have your nice, fancy stuff. It can just be electric.
Okay, in all this talk of visions of the future, I would like to ask both of you, what are your sober dreams of the future, and where do you turn to for inspiration? Who or what has helped you reimagine the future, and how have previous visions of the future been challenged? And here I am particularly talking about our favorite vision of the future in the United States, which is the American dream. I guess like our current way of thinking of the American dream is, you know, like a single family, 5-house, 2-car garage situation may not be totally possible at a global scale. What does it look like in the context of climate crisis?
I'll just say part of my dream, part of my inspiration, which was part of your question, is Rebecca Solnit. I mean, it's really cool to have Rebecca Solnit in Santa Barbara, am I right? A lot of us have been reading her for a long time, because she has written 26 books, and she's just such an inspiration on so many topics. So we're really blessed to have her in the climate lane, which a lane she's been in a long time, just to be clear, but now writing a whole book about it, it's just really exciting. So I'd say that's one source of inspiration, and I'm not just saying that because you're on a stage with me, because I really love your writing, as you know. And I think, Nikayla, your question about like, what's the dream, right? If the dream is not a 2-car garage. I just got rid of my garage, so that's not part of the dream for me. I now have an ADU and no storage, so pray for me. Because I have twin children, so that will go great for us in the long run. So what is the dream? You know, I think people talk a lot about like leisure time and how organizing was actually necessary to get it so that we had a 2-day weekend, right? This was organizing of workers. And I think that how we view consumption and work in the present day is very oriented around, you know, I have to work so that I can make money, so that I can buy stuff. And it's not a cycle that is actually making people very happy. And all of us are in this cycle too, but it's not a deep kind of meaning or profound wholeness. And I think it would be interesting to the degree that we actually integrated like low carbon ways of being that aren't as consumptive. So things like hiking, for example, gardening, my passion, as Louie, my friend who gardens at my house and as the audience knows. These ways of being in nature and being in relation to other beings, living beings, plants, animals, that aren't actually consumptive, that are not extractive, that can be actually the most fulfilling thing. Like, I'm sure people here go hiking and backpacking, right? And I know Eric Smith does, who I can see in the audience. And that is, when you do those kinds of things, I imagine people would agree with me, it's like a kind of feeling in your body that is so deeply healing and is such a profound sense of peace that you do not get from staring at your phone, for example, or a computer, right? And so getting people out in nature and actually experiencing life, I think actually makes us more fulfilled. And the current system is not really enabling us or supporting us in doing that. It's really keeping us inside these sort of phone-oriented, modular ways, right? So Rebecca, what do you think the American Dream 2.0 is?
Whose dream was it? Is always a question. It wasn't the Indigenous American dream. It wasn't the queer American dream. And it was something we were told that we wanted, whether we wanted it or not, and that would make us happy, whether or not it was making people happy. And we're constantly told capitalism wants us to be kind of miserable and isolated and believe that our satisfactions will all come through private life and more stuff. And I think a lot of our joys are going to come through not just private life, which matters, but also public life, feeling like we're members of a community, a social community, a human community, a beyond human community with a natural community, which for good reason either people feel alienated from and that they're not connected to it, or guilty about because they are connected but they feel bad about what we're doing to it. So, but what are my, I think that the best thing about the US is people have always been reimagining the future. Like, what if you could live without monarchy? What if all men were created equal? It would take us another 150 years to get around, like, what if women were people? And some of the other another 80 years after that to whether, black people had certain inalienable rights. But there's always been dreamers that it could be, it could be different. One of the amazing people in this book, Adrienne Marie Brown, says all organizing is science fiction because you've decided to try and make something that doesn't exist yet in the world. So I've been inspired by people who've changed the world, and it doesn't always look like people think. And women in the 19th century said, why should marriage be such a profoundly unequal relationship in which a man gains power over another human being and a woman loses her agency, her name, her financial and bodily autonomy, etc. And, and it's now very normal for marriage to be essentially a relationship between equals. There's a wonderful thing. So the eternally nudgy Terry Gross once asked Gloria Steinem why she didn't get married till her 60s. And Gloria Steinem, without missing a beat, said, first I had to reinvent the institution of marriage. And so it's not only the dreamers, but the realization of their dreams. I'm the same age as the Berlin Wall, but as I always like to say, I moisturize. The Berlin Wall did not moisturize, and look at it now. Actually, at one of these events, somebody gave me a piece of it, which I'm very excited by, but it was very rough and rather concrete-like. And, but, I was born into a world in which women were unequal by both law and culture, and that was completely normal and acceptable. The Ivy Leagues did not accept women, unlike the UC system, which, I'm a Berkeley grad. And so, Jim Crow was the law of the land in the South. The civil rights movement was underway, but most of its achievements in the Voting Rights Act were ahead. I'm a year older than Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's landmark book that really started to give the public a language and a concept to think about the environment in ways that industrialized settler colonialists hadn't yet. that everything is connected to everything else. You put pesticides out to kill one kind of bug, it will kill the birds that eat them. It will get into the water, it will get into the food, it will get into us. That you can't have a world of isolated, alienated objects. You always have a world of systems. I was born into a world where to be queer was to be treated as criminal, mentally ill, or both. And so I've not just seen people who had beautiful dreams, but seen so many of those dreams realized in our times. And that gives me the confidence to imagine that the world could be radically different, because the world is radically different than the one I was born into. I more and more understand that hope is related to memory, despair to amnesia. I often meet people who think nothing ever changes. And if you have any memory over, a decade or more, you don't have to be that old, you see that things change radically. And the bigger your time frame, the more you see change. One of the things I really enjoyed doing for the book, not sure how well I think that chapter came out, but was 2073 is unimaginable, and what will it look like? Who knows? Hopefully we'll have done everything the climate requires of us, but a lot of people can't believe that we can make a world so profoundly different. But all we need to do is look at 1973. The world of 2023 that we're in this very moment is utterly inconceivable in 1973. One of the fun things about 1973 is a lot of the prevailing attitude was like, oh, the civil rights movement really fell apart, didn't make any, isn't making any more ground. The black civil rights movement was not doing great in 1973, but the Indigenous rights movement, the Chicano rights movement, the women's movement, queer liberation movements, and the disability rights movements were all really starting to happen in a big way in the early 70s. But still, it was such a different world. Indigenous and black and feminists and queer activists who had big ideas that it could all be different, but the fact that so many of them have been realized, not perfectly, as you have noticed, we're neither in paradise nor nirvana, but we are in a radically different place than we were before. And I find that really gives me fuel to imagine that that process has not suddenly ground to a halt and we cannot possibly change anything. And so much of my job is to try and infect people with that view.
So the next thing, which you actually mentioned in passing, is all three of us practice in the Buddhist tradition. We have meditation practices, we've gone on retreats, I don't know if you call yourself a Buddhist, I would. And so I want to talk about that. How does that practice relate to our activism? What do you guys think the relationship is there? Obviously, there's a tradition of engaged Buddhism, right? Like that goes through various traditions. A relationship between the spiritual practice and activism. But how does that actually work in your own life? And Nikayla, I want to start with you.
I think with this, I've been really into the hero's journey lately. I think having a spiritual practice and understanding the inner journey and the journey of the self has really made me reflect on the journey of society and what it looks like to come of age as a human species. So what's given me a lot of hope recently, like related to this, is we're all so young as people. Like our species has not been around that long compared to everything else, compared to deep time. So thinking about that, maybe we're at the very beginning of our story, and maybe this crisis is a profound opportunity to undergo like a rapid shift in our conscious mind, to change in a way that maybe we're meant to as people, and that makes me feel very excited and lucky to be alive in this moment, that I get to participate in that kind of change. That I feel that I'm able to with my practice. But related to, personally, related to my activism, I came into meditation and the mindfulness practice right after the 2020 election. My anxiety was I had such a panic attack that I ended up in the emergency room after the 2020 election. So at my grandma's urging, I started a mindfulness practice to help with the anxiety. But then it became a lot more to me than that, than just trying to make myself feel better in a time of heightened panic. And I guess it allowed me to kind of glimpse the inner world and the journey of the self, and put that on the background of the climate crisis, and it all feels much more meaningful, I think, for that reason. And I think along that line too, knowing like freedom internally, I think has made me really aware of how externally I am not free. And externally, I am oppressed. And I think it's made me angry and very sad, but I think gives me like a new kind of determination to participate in great change. And I think along that line in the practice, having an open heart and feeling like a hole in the flute for love to flow in and out has, giving me an acute awareness of my connection to all the other life, to, you two including, on this planet. And I think feeling that love also really steels me in a determination to work on its behalf. So that has been my personal journey with Buddhism and climate activism. And I think on a larger scale, thinking about the social movement, like social movements in the past have, for at least for the last 100 years, had some kind of spiritual grounding. And I think that allows organizers to work out of a place of love and work with a lot of faith and feel grounded in something that's bigger than themselves. And from my perspective right now in the climate movement, that really seems to be lacking. And I think that worries me a bit of how will we continue to go on if as a collective we're not grounded in something greater than ourselves.
Thank you so much. I love talking about being grounded in love for activism. I do think some people are more motivated, and you can really tell the difference between people who are motivated by love or hate, even if they officially share the same goals. It has how they pursue them can have really different impacts. So for me, first of all, I have to say, I don't have a meditation practice alone. I'm really bad at sitting alone. So I'm technically a bad Buddhist. I will wear that label with something, if not pride. Although I did have a very funny moment where a close friend of mine, Janine, who lived at San Francisco Zen Center for 5 years and has had a deep practice, I once said to her, I'm not really practicing anymore. She looked at me and said, Rebecca, everything is practice. Meaning that the way you eat your lunch, the way you relate to the other people on the bus with you, the way you teach your classes, the way you clean your plate, all those things are opportunities for practice. And Buddhism has a lot of really useful ideas for me, and that we get from other arenas as well. For example, non-separation. And one of the things I find really exciting about this moment, and I think I spend more time being excited than terrified, although both of them have some resemblances around destabilization, is I see ideas coming from science, from non-Western cultures and from the indigenous world to rectify some of the grave errors of sort of industrial capitalism. And one of the most crucial ones is that everything is connected to everything else. Buddhism has some beautiful and important versions of that as not just a moral, but a sort of philosophical and practical recognition. There's a wonderful book by the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron called Comfortable with Uncertainty. Buddhism also recognizes that everything is constantly in change. You can't cling to one version of how things are. And I find it useful also, and I've been writing about hope for 20 years now. It began when I saw how hopeless people became when the war broke out in Iraq 20 years ago. And, and I find that both optimists and pessimists want to think they know what's going to happen and form their ideas around it. And I find a kind of non-attachment to outcome that's also a recognition we don't know what's going to happen. We can participate in making it happen. that I find very helpful. But truly, I find that people make up ideas about what and so much of climate doom is that this is exactly what's going to happen, and it's like, so you feel hopeless and you also feel completely in command of, the future. How does that work together? And and it's like they take the authority to craft a version of reality that then renders them helpless, which is very paradoxical and also a real constant problem. So I find that the comfortableness with uncertainty incredibly valuable. And then finally, another core Buddhist teaching, compassion for all beings, a way of being in the world that's based on doing no harm, on compassion, on awareness, which in a sense is your emotional, spiritual, and imaginative connection to go with the physical. Everything is connected to everything else. So I find it not only incredibly useful, but incredibly aligned with a lot of other things that have come. And I was talking about how much the world has changed in my lifetime. And these things are so much more present in our culture, non-West, ideas, Asian, spiritual and philosophical ideas and indigenous worldviews that are also about responsibility and non-separation from the natural world. And science itself is changing so excitingly to recognize more and more not only a world of absolute, inseparable interconnectedness, but also a world that nature is basically socialist, not capitalist. It's not driven primarily by competition, but by symbiosis, mutuality, cooperation, etc., which is a much more beautiful worldview. And so there's a lot of things converging, I think, to really make a new and better culture. And when I look at how radically things are changing, I sometimes think we're doing nothing less than dismantling an old civilization that harmed everybody and marginalized most of us, and building something better in its place. Whether it will outstrip, the new authoritarianism and white supremacy and climate chaos, whether we'll win remains to be seen, but nothing's worth trying more.
Are you gonna add to that, Leah? You also have a practice.
It's funny. My undergrad was in Buddhism. I don't talk about this a lot, but I studied Buddhism academically in undergrad 20 years ago, and I wasn't raised religious, so it was kind of hard. Like, I had to study it rather than doing it, It's not like I knew how to do that, but eventually I found my way to practice, and they talk about the fruits of practice, right? Compassion, loving kindness, joy, that kind of stuff. Well, the real pinnacle is called equanimity. That's when if you're in a boat, you're not going over in either direction. And my whole personality is always going in one direction or another fairly intensely. And so I think building that stillness and anchor that is not as movable to outside forces is something that I do not feel at all I have mastered. I'm still a boat that's going in every direction, being pushed around by the wind, but I'm a little steadier than I used to be. And I think that really helps with the work, because in Buddhism, they talk about the 8 worldly winds. These are like praise and blame, success and failure, pain and pleasure, and fame and disrepute. Basically, these good and bad things that happen in your life. And they happen to all of us. But, as the activism has become a huge part of my life and has really taken over in terms of the amount of public-facing stuff I'm doing, it can be really intense, the winds that are coming at you. And so I have found having a practice and an anchor helps me stay steadier in the work. So that's been a really good thing. Not, again, that I'm enlightened. I'm certainly not. I haven't done that. But even just enough sitting, honestly, 5 to 10 minutes a day, my friends. You can just start with that. So, or just wash your dishes mindfully if you're Zen. Rebecca, I think you get to ask the next question.
I do, and I just wanted to mention that Roshi Joan Halifax, a renowned Buddhist teacher, is one of the people in the book. And one of the things I really like about her, some of the response I see to climate is a sense that we're very fragile and we cannot deal with difficult things. We cannot respond to loss, uncertainty, etc. And she's 80, she's tough as nails, and she has a real sense that human beings are basically tough. But I also think that in Buddhism, you take, a lot of people outside think that the goal of Buddhists is to get enlightened, to get yourself off the wheel of birth and death and suffering. But the Bodhisattva vow is you vow to be reincarnated until all suffering is ended, that you're in the struggle, you're here for it. And which is also an idea that you're here to do stuff, that you're tough, that you have something to contribute. And I love that sense. And I do see in a lot of the climate, the sort of difficult emotion around climate, often a sense of personal frailty. And I think there's a lot of things in this culture that tell us that we're very frail, nothing bad should have ever happened to us, and if something bad happened, we're irrevocably damaged, and of course we're organic. Organic things often heal from damage. If you've ever seen a tree with the bark grows over an axe bite or something, if you've ever had and it's always amazing to me, sometimes I get a cut and then I'm like, oh, it's not there it's better today. Now the skin's closing up, oh, it's gone. And so that toughness also, I think Buddhism is partly about being tough. But the question in this very orderly thing we've got here, which maybe I should be pretending we don't, but am I giving away the teleprompter?
I feel like, to go back to what you were just saying, though, the Bodhisattva vow is kind of like the climate activist vow. Like, I will be reincarnated into activism until all the carbon pollution is gone. Like, I will just be reborn to take out another furnace and another car and another power plant until they're all gone. Yes, I think this is a good vow. Yes.
Yeah. So this is a much more prosaic question. There was a slightly ridiculous magazine article in a major New York magazine that took me and other climate journalists to task. It was by somebody who, so far as I could tell, was brand new to climate, who thought that nobody had been told that climate change, I don't know, how many of you know that climate change is actually really bad? And that we were unduly sunny, which I think really comes from two things, one of which is, when you get a terrible medical diagnosis, you have cancer or some other disease, your first reaction is shock, dismay. If you've forgotten you were mortal, you might suddenly remember it. And often people are really flattened at the beginning, and then they're like, okay, what are my options? What's the best treatment? What's the prognosis? What's the outcome? Let's do these difficult things that might get me through this. And I feel like people I know who've been in climate for a while are often like that, like, yeah, we know it's really bad, we're doing these things. But what's interesting also about the article is its position was that everything's gotten worse since 2018. I'll remind you, Bolsonaro was the president of Brazil. Scott Morrison, another terrible climate villain, was the prime minister of Australia.
I think there was a president in America too back then. Was there?
What was his name?
I can't remember.
The former guy?
It escapes me. Yeah.
Rump?
Yeah. He was a flump, I don't know, a brump, something.
Yes, anyway, and but it's really like, what have you seen change in the last 5 years, whether it's public imagination, cultural? I know, Leah, you're totally monitoring all the practical changes. How have things changed in the last 5 years, and what do you see that's happened?
Well, the really exciting thing is that we have a big climate law in this country, thanks in no small part to some people in this room, including sunrise activists like Nikayla and Naru, who's in the audience.
And Leah Stokes, who was huge for that.
Yeah. So Santa Barbara, as a place, punched above its weight when it came to climate activism, as per usual, right? We love to think we're like the epicenter of climate here, so we can take some credit. So, and the Inflation Reduction Act, I loved, Rebecca in this book made a list of climate-like victories, which is awesome to read. I highly recommend it. A lot of them are Indigenous-led activists, like, blocking the Dakota Access Pipeline, things like Keystone. So there's lots of really cool stuff. And the last one in the list is the Inflation Reduction Act, which I was like, yeah. And, a lot of people have felt that it was flawed and not enough, and it had some bad stuff in it, et cetera. But that's in part how the left functions. Like, we had this massive victory and it was flawed and imperfect and everything else, and we focus on the things that aren't great as opposed to like the 95%, which was really exciting. And the things that are happening like every single week, if you're paying attention, like, oh my God, there's a new solar factory being built in like oh my gosh, Joe Manchin you know that guy, Senator Manchin? He was at a ribbon cutting with Secretary Granholm, Department of Energy, like last week for like a new factory, clean energy factory in West Virginia. And he was going on and on about how great the Inflation Reduction Act was. And you're like, have you met yourself? But he's a weather vane. He blows here and there. Yeah, my friend who used to work in the White House sent me the story about this, and she was like, weather vane is what she wrote. So anyway, for that particular day, he was excited. But that's what's happening. The amount of jobs and investment and how transformative it's going to be in this country, I just don't think we fully understand it yet. So that makes me really excited. Even though it's flawed and imperfect and I don't know. I'm just really excited about it. I think it's going to be a really big change. What about you, Nikayla? You helped pass that law too, so.
I did, yes. Hunger strike is in the book. I think it was either you or Maddo took a class in 2018, environmental policy, but how difficult it was to marry the environment and jobs in the United States. And the Green New Deal, BBB, the inflation
BBB is
Reduction
Build
Act.
Back Better.
Build Back Better, yes, which died, unfortunately. But while it was alive, did a similar thing. But I mean, I think that's the biggest change I've seen is marrying climate and jobs, and that it's actually not a trade-off. That feels like a massive accomplishment and a huge change in the way we think about the environment and how to build it better. But I would say, I think the biggest change that I've seen since 2018, and I think there's a good and a hard side to this, is consumption. And I was actually reading the Hamburg climate report that came out, I think in March, that outlined the 10 social drivers of climate crisis, and the top two that we are not doing so well on are corporate response and consumption. And as a 26-year-old, there's not a whole lot I can do about corporations' response at this moment unless I decide to go work at Amazon, but I don't think that's in my future. But yeah, corporate responses and our consumption in particular really undermining our decarbonization efforts. But in that, I think, while where we're currently at with consumption feels really hard, the good side of it to me feels like there is a recognition that we need to make massive change very quickly in the way that we consume and extract. But I think in the recognition that our consumption is a problem, I think that really opens up the question of how does it stop? How do we stop? And why do we do it in the first place? And it feels like young people particularly are very ripe to ask this question. And while I have not been on TikTok recently, I know there's quite a few influencers online who are asking these questions and looking at, what does a culture look like that consumes less? Because I think that's a big piece of what we have to shift in the coming years. And thinking about why we consume, the system, encourages, incentivizes, sometimes forces us to consume. But I think again, among young people, and I think there's a cultural shift towards more, mental health awareness and looking at the psychological reasons why we want to consume, what's going on inside, why is a lifestyle like this so desirable, filling a void of some kind. And I think what really gives me hope around the cultural shift is that the people around me are really eager to ask these questions and really begin to investigate why we have such an intense desire to consume.
I'll tell you one hopeful consumption fact about young people. They're drinking oat milk a lot more than cow's milk. No, it's true. Cow's milk is very unpopular with Gen Z people. Did you know this? It's true.
We also love public transit. So
they love public transit. Those Gen Z kids, they're the future.
Yeah.
All right, Nikayla, you get the next one.
Oh, thank you. I don't have a way to pivot to this question. But what does it mean to take seriously a generational mandate to heal? Alluding to the earlier question, my earlier statement about kind of our core wounds as a people, and how it's kind of led to this current moment of crisis on all fronts. Thinking about what does it take seriously for us to begin to heal?
And I wonder kind of about the framework. Are people wounded? Do they heal? There's a wonderful passage in the Dear Sugar letters by Cheryl Strayed where somebody's boyfriend says to them, but we're all broken. It's the human condition. And I worry sometimes that people think there's some state, Buddhism has an interesting intersection with this for people who want to become trouble-free and enlightened and safe. But, is there a state of being unwounded? And what is that? And, and I think sometimes it's a helpful framework and sometimes it's not when people perceive themselves or frame what's going on that way. And there is a lot of suffering right now, and I think there's a lot of things that drive that suffering: economic inequality, racism, I think for young people in particular, the precariousness and lack of just the economic difficulty of this moment, the kind of insecurity that drives some people into authoritarianism, I think has a huge impact on all of us. And some people literally, they become homeless through that insecurity. A lot of us just feel like, how will I get through my old age? Will I have enough, etc. So I feel like there's a lot of things now making life really difficult. And I think there's also a lot of loneliness and isolation that creates a lot of angst. And that one of my visions is that what we need, essentially, we're constantly told now that we live in an age of abundance, and we can't do all those things the climate crisis requires of us, because that would take away our beautiful abundance, which is usually just that we have lots of consumer culture stuff for those of us who are middle class and above. And I think you can invert that to say we live in an age of terrible scarcity of clean air, clean water, scarcity of hope and confidence in the society around us, scarcity of sense of safety, of connectedness to each other and to nature. And what the climate crisis requires of us could create an age of abundance, not necessarily of having more stuff per se, but like better public transit, better parks, healthier nature, healthier oceans, better food, better communities, better confidence about the future, etc. So I feel like part of what we need to do is change the framework from, does our abundance come from being isolated but having a lot of stuff, whether it's money or goods, or does our abundance come from being in our deep connections to everything around us? Because I just think that we live in profound scarcity, and that the fossil fuel industry creates a lot of that scarcity, including scarcity of hope and scarcity of health. So that might be another way to cast it, rather than wounds and healing, but that's sort of along the same lines.
I thought it was very on point. I've been thinking a lot that the 20th century created a lot of wreckage, and a lot of it was driven by fossil fuels. If you think even about plastics as a huge problem right now, plastics are made out of petrochemicals. They're a fossil fuel product. I don't know if you guys knew that. And they're now in our bloodstreams, they're in our oceans, they're everywhere, right? And they're bad for us. They have really bad health impacts, hormonal, cancerous, etc. So we did a lot of stuff in the 20th century which we told ourselves were awesome, and turns out had huge secondary effects. Better living through plastics, right? Better living through chemistry. Like, this is a whole rhetoric that turned out to be really false. And so I feel that the 21st century, which we're still at the beginning of in some ways, is an opportunity to heal those wounds. And it's a Pandora's box. The plastics don't go back in the container very easily, right? Like, there are microplastics everywhere. But it's an opportunity to actually have a system of regeneration and healing, and have people work in jobs to clean up the harms, whether that's pesticides, plastics, fossil fuels of the 20th century. This is what the idea of the Civilian Climate Corps really was about. This was Sunrise's big idea of, they wanted $60 billion. I think it was actually more originally, but they're supposed to get $60 billion to create a workforce program, sort of like the Peace Corps, but in the United States, to clean up, old mines or do restoration, deal with landscapes that are at risk for wildfires, etc. And it was a vision that people's productive work could actually be oriented towards societal healing, not just towards societal harm. And I think the movement around care work too, like for example, Adi Barkan, who also lives in Santa Barbara, his activist work around giving people access to health care, home health workers, those are jobs that if we were to fund at a societal level would be low carbon healing jobs that actually create meaning for people, that allow people to live in their communities and homes with dignity. And that is a view of the future that doesn't require the pollution and gives people meaningful work that's well paid and actually heals. So I think that really is a vision that we could have for the future that is, exactly as Rebecca was saying, not one of scarcity, but actually one of abundance, and really centers healing in that kind of way. So I think we are getting near to the end here, but we still have time to ask each other a few more questions. So I don't know if we want to do a lightning round here, Rebecca.
Nikayla's and mine. Nikayla's, what gives you hope? And my question about hope versus fears is motivating people to do the climate work, I think fit together really well. And so can I throw both of them out and we can all take it on?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure.
What gives us hope? Is that the question?
Well, Nikayla had, should I read your whole thing?
No.
And mine was similar. Is it hope or fear that more motivates people, or which or why or how?
Yeah, I'll speak to the hope or fear question. I would say that fear feels like running from something, like the dark woods are encroaching on you, like there's like a monster coming at your heels, running frantically in the dark, and if you stop, something bad's going to happen. But hope feels like running to something, and it's a joyous occasion. And sometimes you can run, or sometimes you can jog, or sometimes you can walk, or you can stop and rest for a while. I admire the poppies on the side of the trail. But I think for me, I know some people can work out of fear, but for me, I really must work out of hope. It doesn't feel like an option. And I think that's also really key to the spiritual practice too, is working from a place of hope and not fear. Fear feels like a wall between my heart and the outside world. But working from a place of hope allows it to stay open and to really work from a place of love. And firmly believe that the next world we're going to build must be built out of love.
That is beautiful, and thank you. And what about you, Leah?
Well, I'm thinking, so Varshini Prakash, one of the co-founders of Sunrise and the current executive director, she did this interview with Ezra Klein a few years ago where she talked about how most of the people who had founded Sunrise were motivated by fear. They were undergrads, they discovered this climate crisis thing, they were oh my God, we're all gonna die, and that really motivated them to dedicate their lives towards climate activism. But when they were workshopping their story and trying to figure out how they would recruit more people to the movement, they quickly discovered that what had motivated them was not what motivated normal people. And so sometimes for activists, we may come to things through fear, or maybe we're super anxious people, I don't know, that's why we need to meditate all the time. But normal people, they don't necessarily feel that way. And so I think we have to recognize that what might work for one group of people is not necessarily what works for others. And in my own practice and activism around climate, I tend to be fairly hopeful. Somebody yesterday called me Mrs. Hope or something, or Ms. I'm not a Mrs. A Ms. Hope or something, which I thought was funny. So I tend to feel like there's optimism, there's technologies that we have that we can use. I mean, I just got to say this one, no, I'll say it later. So yeah, I tend to be hopeful. And I mean, clearly you wrote a book called Not Too Late, Rebecca, so I imagine and you also wrote a book called Hope in the Dark. So I imagine you are motivated by hope too.
I'm transparent on that front.
The market. So the last question we're going to talk about, this is always the question that I'm sure all three of us get asked, so I wanted to talk about it, which is what can I do? climate change, overwhelming, oh my God, I want to do something, and that's amazing. And you probably have a hunch that plastic straws is not going to cut it. So what can I do? How do you guys answer that? I just want to mention that activism is actually improvisational. Like, it's not just, okay, I give you a cookie cutter answer and that's what you can do. Just today, somebody tagged me on Twitter and said they were quitting their aerospace engineering job to become a solar engineer, and they were like inspired. I was like, cool, that's great, you know, but like I can't tell each and every one of you to go become a solar engineer. It's improvisational. It's based on your own life and your own moment. But I'd love to hear, Nikayla, how do you answer that question of what can I do for other people, for yourself?
It's a tough time in the movement right now. And what can I do? I mean, I think a few years ago it would be to like join an organization. And I still believe that to be true. But I think it's also taking inventory of your own skills and gifts and abilities and really looking at what could my best contribution be to this fight with who I was born as. What am I able to give? And I feel like that's probably the best place for most people to start.
The climate activist Bill McKibben is often asked, what's the most impactful thing I can do as an individual? And he just always says, stop being an individual, meaning join something, become part of something. And I agree with Nikayla, not everybody was born to join a group. But I think one of the pitfalls I often see that the fossil fuel industry has pushed is to think of us as individuals, and all we can do is be virtuous individuals that we can recycle and have very tiny carbon footprints. But even if everybody, all of us became very virtuous and had tiny carbon footprints, we actually need profound system change, and that I think involves being part of something larger. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I think voting matters, supporting progressive climate candidates matters, donating if you have resources. And there's a lot of times people act like giving money is not real activism, but let me tell you, movements need money, and if you work hard to do X and then you give, you know, a piece of what you earned to something else, you're giving your labor. Your labor may have been as a pediatrician or a janitor or a teacher or something, but it's still your labor that you're contributing. And I feel like everybody has something to give. And one of the things that's lovely in this book is that the amazing climate activist Marianne Hagler, based in New Orleans, wrote an essay called What Can I Do?, talking about the fact that everybody has some, it's actually called Here's Where You Come In, that everybody has some gifts, everybody has something that they want to do, everybody has a place in it. It's not always easy and obvious to discover. Some people love ringing strangers' doorbells. I know I do it occasionally, and I find it kind of petrifying and intense. So I think it's like figuring, there's a lot of different things that need to happen. I also think people can work at all scales. Often people think that from outside, think the only change that's happening is national, and if we're failing nationally, but things are happening at this internationally, they're happening at the state level, they're happening at the level of regions, cities. Sometimes you're just going to be the person who's going to get solar panels to cover the parking in your high school, or you're going to, you know, are you a person who wants to make things happen like renewables or stop things like pipelines and fracking from happening? There's so much that needs to be done, is both the good news and the bad news, and there's kind of something for everyone.
I think that's so true. And my answer to this question is take an inventory of the fossil fuel machines in your life. You may not know this, but you may be in relationship with fossil fuel machines. Your car, your furnace, your stove, even the hedge trimmer, that might be running on fossil fuels too. And make a plan for how you're going to make those machines run on electricity instead. Because electricity is cleaner across the board, doesn't matter. Your car's already cleaner if you run it on electricity than fossil fuels. It's like 100% clean in Vermont, and even in Hawaii where they burn oil for their electricity, it's still cleaner. That's how efficient the electric machine is, don't worry. And then you're like, oh my God, the mining. Guess what? The mining for an electric vehicle, if it's this big, the mining for electric vehicle, right? So the gas-powered car, the mining associated with that, because you may know you have to dig up the oil every single time you fill the tank. I don't know if you realize that. It disappears into the air, so it's easy to forget. But you're mining every single time you fill up your car. So, think about the machines in your life that are fossil fuel powered and make a plan to change them. And if you don't know how to do that, Rewiring America, this organization I work with, rewiringamerica.org, is going to launch a whole calculator this summer to help you plan how to do that. And there's also now money that helps you do that too. And if you don't own these machines because you're a student, well, guess what? Maybe your parents own some, maybe your grandparents own some, maybe your neighbors do. Go bug some people. That sounds fun too, right? Go lobby some people. And then you can figure out how to change machines that are bigger. Like, how could we electrify the schools in Santa Barbara? This is something I'm currently obsessing over. Those are machines that run on fossil fuels. Now they got solar panels, which is awesome. Laura Capps was very involved with that, along with others. Love her. How do we make those machines run on electricity in the schools? Or maybe, the campus. There's now a decarbonization study here, and I'm sure some people are a part of it. How do we make the machines on this campus run on electricity? So clean electricity plus electrification is actually a solution that we can deploy that's cost effective today, and that, guess what, there's 1 billion machines in America alone that run on fossil fuels, less than 1 billion Americans, which means we can all adopt a couple machines as our personal quest. So I would really encourage people to do that. But that's not the only thing you can do lots more. So we've come to the end here. I want to thank a few people. First, I want to thank Danny Schulman and Kristen Palmstrom, who made a lot of effort to help get the AV organized, get you all here. Big thanks to them. Thanks to the fine gentlemen who are filming and recording us. I want to thank Dean Hale, who gave us a wonderful introduction and helped the 2035 initiative get off the ground with funding from the university, which we really appreciate. I want to thank Matto Mildenberger, who is the current director of the 2035 initiative. I want to thank all of you who decided to not enjoy the sunshine this evening and came here instead. And finally, I would like to thank Rebecca Solnit, who drove all the way down from San Francisco to grace us with her brilliance, and Nikayla Jefferson, who will soon be heading off into the world and no longer be a wonderful resident of Santa Barbara. And so one last time here, like a graduation, to share all of her wisdom with you. So please, if you'd like to stick around, we're going to be signing books in the back at the Chaucer's book stand. Please support our amazing local bookstore, which I know you all love. And just thank you so much for joining us. So please join me in thanking Rebecca and Nikayla for being here tonight.